Most people picture Jesus as endlessly welcoming, always available, always willing, always ready to heal whoever approached with faith. The truth is something else entirely. What happened that afternoon on the outskirts of Tyre demanded that a foreign woman swallow a word that in the mouth of any other Jewish man of that era would have been a shattering insult. This is the story they never told you about the most uncomfortable encounter in the Gospels. Put yourself in the exact context of that moment. Jesus had just crossed an ethnic and religious boundary loaded with centuries of accumulated hatred. The region of Tyre and Sidon in present-day Lebanon lay roughly 60 kilometers northwest of the Sea of Galilee, a 3 to 4 day journey on foot through rough terrain, crossing hills, dry valleys and roads patrolled by Roman soldiers. This wasn't a stroll, it was a strategic retreat. The records in Mark chapter 7 verses 24 through 30 and Matthew chapter 15 verses 21 through 28 show a Jesus trying to hide. The Greek text uses an expression that translates as, "He did not want anyone to know." Consider the situation. The man who multiplied loaves for 5,000, who walked on water, who raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, was now looking for a house to rest in pagan territory, away from the eyes of the Pharisees who had just confronted him over ritual purity traditions. And it was precisely in that moment of silent exhaustion that she appeared. The Gospels call her by two different names. Matthew identifies her as a Canaanite woman, a title carrying massive historical weight. Mark describes her as Syrophoenician by birth and Greek by culture. Both designations matter. Canaanite evoked Israel's ancient enemies, peoples condemned since the time of Joshua, more than 1,200 years before this scene. Syrophoenician identified her as a coastal city dweller, heir to the civilization that invented the alphabet, that dominated Mediterranean trade, and that worshipped Baal, Astarte, and Melkart. In other words, she was everything that official Jewish theology considered impure, dangerous, and unworthy of approach. Consider the religious climate of the time. An observant Jew did not enter a Gentile's home, did not eat their food, did not drink from their vessels, did not touch them without undergoing a lengthy ritual purification process afterward. Later rabbinic lists compiled in the Talmud and the Mishnah document at least 17 different categories of contact that required specific ritual baths. The boundary between Jew and Gentile was not merely geographical. It was a psychological wall built brick by brick over more than 5 centuries. And she, a desperate mother, crossed that wall armed with a single weapon: urgency. Her daughter was possessed. The Greek text uses the term daimonizetai, indicating continuous demonic possession, not episodic. The child lived in a permanent state of torment. Without knowing precisely what afflicted that girl, ancient accounts of similar phenomena describe repetitive convulsions, self-harm, abrupt changes in voice, prolonged periods without eating or sleeping, episodes of physical strength wildly disproportionate to her age. Modern medicine would identify many such cases as combinations of severe epilepsy, profound psychiatric disorders, or rare neurological syndromes. For that child's parents, the name of the diagnosis did not matter. What mattered was her silence after the episodes. What mattered was the vacant look in the intervals between. Calculate the toll on a mother who had been managing that for months, perhaps years. Chronic sleep deprivation, interrupted meals, round-the-clock surveillance, neighbors who stopped visiting, relatives who suggested committing the girl to some temple of Asclepius, the pagan god of healing, where priests applied brutal treatments involving animal blood and nocturnal chanting. Physicians of the era charged the equivalent of 3 months' wages for a manual laborer per consultation, with no guarantee of results. The medical records of Galen, written a century later, show that cases of possession were considered incurable by standard Greco-Roman medicine. She had exhausted every option, every single one. And then word reached her ears about the foreign rabbi who healed with a word. This was no casual rumor. Tyre maintained constant trade with Galilee. Caravans made the route twice a month, carrying olive oil, dried fish, fabrics, and pottery. Each caravan also carried stories of lepers cleansed in seconds, of blind men seeing again after decades, of a demoniac in Gerasa, on the far shore of the lake, set free after living among tombs, cutting himself with stones, possessed of superhuman strength. She heard all of it, and she held it close. When she learned that Jesus had crossed the border, she dropped everything. She moved through streets where, as a woman, a Gentile and alone, she was in constant danger. She disregarded the social rules forbidding any woman from publicly addressing a strange man without the presence of her husband or a male relative. The Phoenician social codes recorded in contemporary inscriptions were nearly as restrictive as the Jewish ones on this point. But there is one detail that makes the episode even stranger, and it has not been fully revealed yet. When she reached Jesus and cried out for mercy, he said nothing. Total silence. The text of Matthew chapter 15 verse 23 is categorical. But he did not answer her a word. Imagine the weight of that silence. A mother pleading out loud saying, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." And the man who came to heal simply says nothing, keeps walking as if she were wind. The disciples grew uncomfortable. They asked Jesus to send her away, to say something, anything, so she would stop shouting and go on her way. Their discomfort was both cultural and practical. This woman causing a public scene threatened the discretion Jesus had tried to maintain. She drew stares. She gathered an audience, she shattered the plan for rest, and then Jesus finally speaks. But not to her. He speaks to the disciples. The sentence that comes out of his mouth sounds like an inflexible theological filter. "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. Think about the impact of this. The woman hears everything. She's standing right there, listening to the man in whom she placed her last hope publicly declare that his mission excludes people like her, that she falls outside his pastoral map, that her daughter, in terms of his stated priorities, simply does not make the list. Any normal person would have given up, would have retreated in humiliation, would have walked home carrying the additional weight of religious rejection from a people who considered themselves chosen. She did not retreat. Instead, she did something that no disciple, no Pharisee, no teacher of the law at that time had managed to do with such clarity. She knelt before Jesus. The Greek verb prosekine indicates continuous worship, reverent prostration, the same gesture reserved for kings and deities, and she said 3 words, "Lord, help me." Follow the mechanics of this scene. The Gentile woman, considered impure, considered an ancestral enemy, is practicing more advanced theology than most of Jesus' official followers. She is acknowledging messianic authority. She is worshipping. She is using the title Kyrios, Lord, with the full weight of divinity behind it. And this is the moment where the word arrives that has scandalized readers for 20 centuries. Jesus responds, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." Matthew 15, verse 26. Pause and absorb what that sentence appears to say on a first reading. To contemporary ears, it sounds like a cruel insult. It sounds like religious racism. It sounds like Jesus calling a desperate mother a dog. And it was precisely that surface reading that generated centuries of distorted interpretation, awkward sermons, and theological attempts to justify what seemed like a crack in the divine character. But the original Greek tells a different story. The word used is not kion, which means a street dog, a filthy animal, a despicable creature, the standard term Jews used pejoratively when referring to Gentiles. The word Jesus uses is kinarion, an affectionate diminutive meaning a little house dog, a household pet, an animal that slept inside the home and ate near the table. The distinction is absolute in first-century Greek. Kion was an insult. Kinarion was tenderness. Examine the details of this linguistic choice. Street dogs, kions, roamed in packs, ate carrion, and were considered unclean under Mosaic law. Kinaria, little house dogs, were raised from puppies inside Phoenician and Greek households, and those cultures were famously known for keeping animals as part of the family. Funerary inscriptions discovered in Sidon and Byblos show tombs dedicated to pet dogs with moving verses written by their owners. Paintings on pottery from the period show these animals playing with children, receiving pieces of food directly from their owners' hands during meals. When Jesus said Kinarion, he was not insulting. He was invoking a domestic, affectionate image, one familiar from her own culture, in which the little dog was part of the household, received food, and held a recognized place. And she understood immediately. Her response is one of the most brilliant recorded in all of ancient literature. Yes, Lord, but even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Matthew 15, verse 27. Mark preserves a slightly different version, but the core is identical. Notice the theological ingenuity of that comeback. She does not deny the metaphor. She expands it. She does not argue that she deserves the children's bread. She accepts the position of the little household dog. But she reminds the master that in the economy of the home, even domestic animals share in the owner's abundance, that there is enough left over for everyone, that the grace of Jesus is so vast that even its crumbs are sufficient to heal a possessed child. She passed a test no one realized was a test, and this is exactly where many modern commentators miss the point. That entire exchange was not a moment of Jesus being ethnically rude. It was intentional theological pedagogy, staged in front of the Jewish disciples who needed to learn a lesson that would reshape the history of the early church forever. The disciples had just witnessed the conflict over ritual purity in Gennesaret. They had heard Jesus declare that nothing entering a man defiles him. What comes from the heart is what makes a person impure. And still they had not grasped the practical implications. Now they would see, in flesh, in voice, in tears. Think about the narrative sophistication of the moment. Jesus performs the standard prejudice of the disciples. He voices in the first person exactly what they silently believed about Gentiles. He mirrors their exclusivist theology back at them. And then he lets the pagan woman, considered by them unworthy, demonstrate deeper faith, more radical humility, and sharper theology than any of them had shown in months of daily companionship. Jesus' reaction to her response is among the rarest moments in the Gospels. "O woman, great is your faith, let it be to you as you desire." Matthew 15, verse 28. Mark records the complementary version, "For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." Mark 7, verse 29. In the entire New Testament, only two people receive the explicit praise of great faith directly from the mouth of Jesus. One is the Roman centurion of Capernaum, a Gentile soldier. The other is this Syrophoenician woman. Two Gentiles, two outsiders, two people absent from Israel's official religious geography, and both praised above the Jewish disciples themselves. That is not a coincidence. That is a declaration. The daughter was healed at that exact instant. Mark is specific about the geographic detail. The woman returned home and found the child lying on the bed, calm, free, restored. No convulsions, no vacant stare, no supernatural strength, just a girl exhausted by months of torment, finally at peace. Calculate the emotional distance of that final scene. That mother ran through entire streets with her heart pounding, not knowing what state she would find her daughter in. She may have imagined 1,000 scenarios on the walk back. She may have doubted with every step. She may have repeated to herself the words Jesus had spoken, as if holding something fragile between her hands. And when she opened the door, she found the silence she had waited for during all those months. Good silence. The silence of a daughter breathing peacefully. But the episode carries layers that reach far beyond the individual miracle. Consider the strategic geographical context. Tyre was a city that, centuries earlier, had been cursed by the prophets of Israel. Isaiah chapter 23, Ezekiel chapters 26 through 28, and Amos chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, all prophesied destruction against Tyre for its commercial arrogance, its oppression of Israel, and its involvement in human trafficking. The city was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar after a 13-year siege. It was destroyed again by Alexander the Great, who built a stone causeway stretching roughly 800 meters across the sea to reach the island fortress in 332 BC. Thousands of its inhabitants were killed or enslaved. And it is precisely in this territory of ancient prophetic curses that Jesus performs one of the most symbolically loaded miracles of his entire ministry. The theological irony is precise. The same region marked by centuries of divine judgment now receives the first clear indication that messianic mercy would cross ethnic boundaries. Not by accident, by design. Witness the most subtle moment in this passage. Jesus does not initiate the dialogue. She does. Jesus does not seek her out. She crosses the city to find him. Jesus appears to resist. She persists. The narrative initiative rests entirely on her side. And it is that initiative, that theological insistence, that spiritual courage, that opens the door for healing. First-century theologians of the early church identified this episode as one of the hermeneutical pillars of the book of Acts. When Peter has the vision of the sheet descending from heaven filled with unclean animals, in Acts chapter 10, he is confronting the same prejudice the disciples confronted that afternoon in Tyre. When Paul writes to the Galatians that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, he is building doctrine on the precedent established in this encounter. When the Council of Jerusalem, in Acts 15, decides not to impose circumcision on Gentile converts, it is institutionally applying what this woman won personally. The theology of inclusion began with a desperate mother and a metaphorical little dog. Consider yet another layer. The word Kenarian that Jesus used was not merely affectionate, it was also ironic. The Pharisees called Gentiles Keones, street dogs. Jesus deliberately subverts their vocabulary. He replaces the standard insult with domestic tenderness. He does this in front of the disciples, who likely used the pejorative term in everyday speech without a second thought. It is a subtle correction of racist vocabulary applied through a single different letter in the Greek. Small change, immense teaching, and the most discreet detail of the entire scene, the one that escapes most surface readings: Jesus never touched the girl. He did not go to the house. He did not lay on hands. He did not pronounce a direct exorcism over her body. The healing happened at a distance, by word alone, by the faith of that mother alone. It is the second remote miracle recorded in the Gospels. The first was the healing of the centurion's servant. Both involved Gentiles. Both involved intermediaries of great faith. Both demonstrated that the power of Christ was not limited by physical proximity, ritual purity, or ethnic origin. Zero distance, zero border, zero limit. Consider how many times throughout history this episode has been misread. Comfortable preachers turned it into a justification for pastoral impatience. Embarrassed commentators tried to explain how Jesus could have been harsh before softening. Ancient translators went so far as to omit the nuances of the Greek diminutive to smooth over the apparent roughness. But all these interpretations start from the wrong assumption. There was no harshness. There was staged pedagogy. There was no prejudice. There was the unmasking of someone else's prejudice. Jesus was not teaching the woman, he was teaching the disciples, and by extension every reader who would come after. The Syrophoenician woman disappears from the record after this episode. We have no name for her. We don't know what became of the healed daughter. We don't know whether she became a follower, whether she reported the experience to her community, whether she lived long enough to see the early church reach Tyre decades later, during the missionary journeys recorded in Acts 21, verses 3 through 7. When Paul encounters Christian disciples in that very city. The later tradition, recorded in the writings of Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, suggests that a significant Christian community existed in Tyre in the very first decades after the resurrection. Perhaps planted by seeds from that afternoon. Perhaps not. The biblical text maintains a respectful silence, but her name, or the absence of it, matters less than the gesture. She taught the church to persist. She taught that true faith does not retreat in the face of apparent silence, does not give up when the first response is harsh, does not interpret the test as rejection, recognizes the humble place without surrendering access, accepts the metaphor without losing courage, transforms apparent exclusion into an argument for inclusion. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of this strange encounter. That woman did not ask for the rules to be changed to accommodate her. She did not demand privilege. She did not claim rights. She simply affirmed with acute humility that even the crumbs from the Lord's table were sufficient to heal the life she loved. And in that affirmation, she quietly reconfigured the entire theological structure that had kept Jews and Gentiles separated for 1,500 years. There was no speech, no manifesto, no visible revolution. There was only a mother kneeling, a child healed, a word understood in the right diminutive, and a door left ajar so that centuries later, billions of people could approach that same table. That afternoon in Tyre ended an era, the era in which divine mercy seemed to carry a restricted ethnic map, and it inaugurated another. The era in which any person from any origin, in any corner of the world, speaking any mother tongue, could draw near, acknowledging the humble place, and still be welcomed at the table. What those people did not see, did not hear, and could not have known, is that exchange of less than 2 minutes, recorded on a dusty road between Tyre and Sidon, would become one of the founding pillars of global Christian identity. That the silent gesture of a Gentile mother would resonate across continents, centuries, and entire civilizations. That the metaphorical little dog would become a liberating image for countless people who, in their own cultures, languages, and circumstances, would discover that they too had a place at the table. She did not come to claim a seat at the table. She came looking for crumbs enough to save a life. She received far more than that. She received the public acknowledgement of the Lord himself that her faith was greater than the faith of those who lived beside him every single day. And without knowing it, she opened the door for all of Gentile humanity to one day, after the cross, sit at the table as children, not as little dogs. That nameless mother taught the world that persisting with humility is, more often than not, the most transformative act of faith.